Well, this is the last video in this little sequence that I'd like to talk about the Chinese Communist Party and the communist underpinnings to Mao Zedong. I've repeatedly said we do need to understand Mao as a communist leader. Marxism was purportedly such a big part of his life. He devoted his life, it would seem, to being a communist party member, a Marxist, this ideology. But also we've got to always remind ourselves that we don't want to see him as anything other than a dictator at times. That to think that Mao is acting in accordance with the ideas of Karl Marx and genuinely building a communist utopia according to Marxism was probably overstating it a bit. So I'd like you to keep thinking about how we can see communist ideology in the actions of Mao, but also see the brutal exercise of power. In this final video, I'm going to draw some parallels between the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, under Lenin and then Stalin, particularly Stalin as a totalitarian one-party state leader, one who might talk the language of Marxism, the language of Leninism, but live very much a totalitarian regime's brutal use of power, be authentically totalitarian on a scale that leaves someone like Hitler behind. I'd like to pick up on that as a parallel to Mao. Mao, in many ways, sees Joseph Stalin as a contemporary, a model, almost a mentor, certainly up until, and the Soviet Union certainly up until about 1957. Let's explore this idea. I don't know what this is doing on my screen, but okay, we've got rid of it. Let's move forward. So Marxism and communism first gives rise to the communist revolution of 1917 in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. And we've spoken about how Russia was not a state that seemed ready for the process of heading towards communism according to Marxist ideology. This process of historical materialism said that nations needed to have an industrial working class in the cities that rise up and throw off a capitalist class, and Russia really had neither of those in 1917. The Bolsheviks had to justify through Leninism that they had accelerated the program. They had stepped forward. The Bolsheviks took Marx's model, called themselves the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and therefore communists, without actually matching Marxist theory, which they held so close to their heart. In Russia, there was actually a large peasant class. It was largely non-industrial. The society of Russia was essentially a feudal structure. And from that, the Bolsheviks, who subscribed to Marxist thinking, called themselves the Communist Party, I guess that cadre, and they created a one-party dictatorship. They essentially are arguing in the early days that this is the dictatorship of the proletariat and that they're creating a better future. But it actually becomes increasingly totalitarian and seems to serve power as its own end. It seeks to radically transform Russian society and to modernize, but the purposes for that are perhaps a little unclear. Are they serving the needs of the dictators themselves like Stalin? Are they a form of nationalism, in fact, when supposedly Marxism is internationalist? So in the Soviet Union, in Russia and its associated nations, between 1917 and 1991, we actually have Marxism turned into first Leninism and then Stalinism. And Stalinism is an unbelievably strict totalitarian state. Stalinist Russia is the model for George Orwell's 1984, that great dystopian book of the future. I've put on the screen there the symbol of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It becomes the Soviet Union's flag. USSR's flag, the hammer of the worker, the proletariat, and the sickle, the scythe, if you like, the hand scythe of the peasantry, and a gold star on the red flag of revolution. In parallel, we have the other great, huge communist nation emerging in the People's Republic of China at the end of the Civil War between 1945 and 1949. The Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, defeat the Kuomintang in a civil war. Now, this Chinese Communist Party was actually adapting many of the structures, many of the procedures, the behaviours, if you like, of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So the CCP, in many respects, mirrors its parent, if you like, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The early Communist Party in China was funded, supported, trained by Comintern agents, the Communist International Organization's agents, who were Bolsheviks, Communist Party of the Soviet Union members. So there's a close connection there. Again, the circumstances existing in China between 1945 and 1949 certainly don't match the preconditions for Marxist theory to reach this point of development of communism. China is not an industrial state. In fact, more so than the Soviet Union, it is peasant-based. About 85% of the population in 1949 in China are peasants. They're rural, they're farming. Further, not only is it not in the same model of the capitalist overclass who are ruling the proletariat, but it also doesn't even have a feudal structure. At times, the Communist Party make it sound like it has a feudal structure to marry up and match up with the Soviet Union, but to imagine it as a truly feudal structure under the Qing Empire is kind of missing the point as well. So this creation of a one-party dictatorship that's increasingly totalitarian in China becomes based around a mythology of the cult of Mao. The one-party dictatorship that calls itself communist in China uses the language of Marxism. It uses the ideas of Marxism. But in many respects, it's actually mirroring the behaviours of Stalinist Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union, that parallel state, China, under the communists, the People's Republic of China, seeks to radically transform society and modernise. Both states do this firstly through agricultural reform and then through an industrialisation process. In the Soviet Union, the process of reforming the countryside and changing the peasantry is called collectivisation. It's then followed by 5-year plans of industrialisation. The CCP in China begin a process of collectivising the countryside, and it's called the land reform movement of the 1950s. By 1958, the Chinese Communist Party has its own 5-year plan of industrialisation, but it's referred to as the Great Leap Forward. So Leninism and Stalinism is mirrored in China by Maoism. And you can see this in the symbolism. Perhaps both regimes, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's regime in the USSR and Mao's Chinese Communist Party's regime in the People's Republic of China, perhaps they're both characterised best as one-party totalitarian states. Certainly one-party dictatorships. They use fear. They develop cults of personality around their leaders and seek to keep their power closely held to an elite group of party members. Perhaps they are communist in the sense of using the language and the imagery of Marxism. Perhaps it was the unifying set of ideas that drew these people to the party initially. But the ideas of Marxism, the ideas of communism, seem to be used ultimately to identify opponents, to identify the priorities and the unifying features of their society, perhaps to justify actions. So reflect on that. I think that's not a bad spot to leave it.